I would argue that if you Brits had started talking about a lot of these issues in a more sensible, open, and way of acknowledging that these concerns exist around migration and that there are pressures on the systems, and that also people feel uncomfortable with rapid change, not necessarily change per se, but the pace of change, you might be in a bit of a different situation.
So then, Liverpool, Bristol, Hull, and Belfast, just four of the towns or cities where clear up operations are underway after the most extensive day of riots and violent far right protests across the UK. Around 90 people were arrested yesterday. Sir Keir Starmer held a call from Chequers with key ministers to discuss the wave of unrest. Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, said, "We've been clear, the police have our full backing in taking the strongest possible action against perpetrators, including making sure there are more prosecutors, sufficient prison places, and the court stand ready." Latika, is the government doing enough in response to the violent riots that we've witnessed in the last few days?
Well, they haven't stopped, have they? I mean, if they were doing enough, they would have stopped. Now, that might be sound very simplistic because the government and the police are facing a lot of forces here. These groups are clearly rapidly mobilized via social media and messaging apps, which is something that they didn't have necessarily at the same scale and at the same force in the London riots. But I think some early quick arrests and some strong sentences would do wonders at this point in time. And I think that the decision to open the courts 24 hours has been a really good one. Now it needs to be put to use.
Peter?
We're treating the symptoms and not the cause here. There is absolutely no excuse for anything that has happened in these riots. There's absolutely nothing to be condoned. It is all to be condemned. There is no excuse to pick up a brick, a bottle, fire it at the police, disrespect the police, or set fire to anything. I'm not going to say a however, but there is a however. And the however is if you I mean, look, there are some people who just want to fight with the police. There's no doubt about that. Those thugs exist. There are also people who would never dream of doing any of those things that those rioters have done. But they look on those rioters and say, well, maybe they have a point. I don't think they have a point, but there are some people who do, and they believe that they're not being listened to, that there's a disconnection between what some people call the political class in this country. Maybe I'm part of it, the establishment, I suppose, and the people who raise legitimate, reasonable concerns, perhaps not the most articulately expressed, about things like immigration, things like the changing nature of our country. I spoke yesterday. Talk is a very different station to Times, obviously, but yesterday in 3 years, I've never had as much of a response as I did on my show yesterday to people really, really, really angry with Keir Starmer, thinking that he has basically called anybody who disagrees with him racist. I don't think he has, but a lot of people have that impression. There are people calling him two-tier Keir, saying, why have you talked about all the completely correctly calling out the far right and not calling out, for example, not mentioning Leeds, not mentioning the riots there. These are not necessarily my opinions, but they're opinions that I am getting all the time. And I think there's a lot. If you suppress things and if you say you can't talk about certain things, or if you say to have concerns about immigration, that makes you racist, well, then that is going to create if you push it down, if you don't let people ventilate, if you don't have those conversations, if you just, call people this horrible word, gammons or whatever, then you're going to get a situation where people are really, really angry. There's no excuse for it. Not saying for a second that violence is in any way justified, but we need to think about why this has happened.
Latika, I want to just build on that with some comments we had from Stephen Riker about an hour ago on this programme, who's Professor of Social Psychology at the University of St Andrews, who, sort of building on what Peter was saying, he said that, and having studied the 2011 riots in London that then spread to other cities as well, he said, actually, this is about addressing the problems in people's lives, especially on deprivation, but actually it's about having a dialogue with those people to create a sense of control, that they are involved in decision-making and in making progress. Rather than sort of doing things to people, or indeed for people, you need to do things with people. And if you don't, when you don't, you end up in a situation potentially like this. And then the other bit of that is around the politicians' language, which I'm quite fascinated by. So to describe, for example, riots such as this as mindless is actually not constructive, because these people are acting on beliefs, and while their beliefs may cause action that people then have concerns about and concerns over, they are still beliefs that need to be considered and engaged with.
Yeah, I think what Peter says is absolutely right. Usually he and I are in furious agreement, so no surprises this morning. But I think there's a lot of things that can be true at once. And some of the commentary I've seen, particularly online, particularly from the left, actually really misses this point. Yes, you can have people who are misinformed. Yes, you can have people who hold bigoted views. Yes, you can have people who are just turning up at these riots because it's opportunism. But all the other things can be true and shouldn't be ignored as well. That populism, dissatisfaction, people who are willing and might not have been part of that former mob to turn to violence to make a point, or get caught up in it, or get carried away in a wild moment. Those things don't come from nowhere. And it's also not contained to the UK. And I think one of the surprises people have, or the feelings why it's so shocking when it happens in the UK, is because you guys just traditionally do not do this. We don't see this very often in Britain. We do see it in other countries, and we wouldn't be as surprised if we saw it taking place in other countries. But populism has roots in dissatisfaction. It has roots in systems that don't work or are seen to not be working for a broad mass of people. You don't have to look very far to know that that's a strong feeling within the UK that needs to be listened to, heard, and dealt with. Look at the last election. There was a very strong anyone but the major two parties vote there. And a lot of votes went to parties on the fringes. And there's a reason for that. And we do have to look at it. And I think one of the missed opportunities for Keir Starmer and the Labor government so far has been finding a way to say, look, violence is violence, crime is crime, and you are going to be dealt with in the way that we all expect you shall be dealt with. But on the other hand, we all understand that when you voted for change, you wanted to see the system repaired. And I'm here to do that. And here's 5 ways I'm already trying to sort out these issues.
Latika speaks complete sense on this. I want to talk just briefly about Southport, if I can. So there are a lot of people, I'm sure, who are absolutely baffled at why the horrendous killing of those 3 little girls in Southport was, to some people, the spark for this. What on earth has this got to do? Obviously, we know there was disinformation, misinformation. There were things that were completely wrong there. There was a riot in Southport, which nobody in Southport wanted, or very, very few people in Southport wanted. We had actually the mother of one of those girls saying, stop this, just do not do this. So there are, I think, a lot of people who would never dream of being involved in any of this kind of rioting who are absolutely baffled by that. And I'm interested in that, and why, we've had this very, very dramatic week in our island story. I think, actually, news-wise, it has been really, really intense. And I think there is no connection, really, of course, between the act of a madman and a violent person who did this horrible thing and what is happening now. But also there kind of is, weirdly. There shouldn't be, but there are just some people, rightly or wrongly, who say, how, the heckler, for example, who said, how could this, come on, Keir Starmer, couldn't have this been prevented, who's next? And there is just this sense that there is a complete disconnection between casting your vote, taking part in the democratic process, and what you get in return. And that's manifested in so many ways. That's paying lots of tax and not being able to get a GP's appointment. That's, school places, housing. That's lots and lots of different things. There is no excuse for this. There is no justification for attacking the police. I'm not condoning it at all. But this is the sort of 0.001% of that real anger that lots of other people feel they just don't manifest it in this way.
Don't we also have to think about politicians' language and responsibility of it? I mean, Veronica's just got in touch here saying, what about the language of people like Suella Braverman, who use the word invasion? For years, we have had right-wing politicians using words about, flooding. I mean, Nigel Farage's language, and during the whole Brexit referendum, the posters of, the kind of invasion from Europe. Isn't there a sense as well, as much as there needs to be action from the government, And I mean, to be fair, the government has only been in power less than, nearly a month tomorrow. You know, how much action can you actually, yes, you can speak about things, but how much action can you bring in a month? But I just wonder as well about the responsibility, Latika, here, of politicians to rein in their language and think about, when you are constantly dripping this idea of an invasion, is there not always going to be a consequence of that? Perception versus reality, isn't it?
I'm going to be very controversial here. I would argue that if you Brits had started talking about a lot of these issues in a more sensible, open and way of acknowledging that these concerns exist around migration and that there are pressures on the systems, and that also people feel uncomfortable with rapid change, not necessarily change per se, but the pace of change, you might be in a bit of a different situation. But I think there's a tendency for the British, at least I've observed, and particularly when I was in Australia, that when Australia was having these same conversations, people would look at us and say, well, you're racist because you don't like immigration and you want to control your asylum seeker movements. Now, there was a lot of inflammatory language, and Australia had a very tortured debate about this. But in the end, the entire community came to the point where I think the British public is now at, which is illegal immigration is not okay. There has to be a way that people can come to our country. We know who's coming in and we welcome them when they've come in through a process. But what can't be tolerated is anyone just taking it into their own hands, paying a people smuggler and rocking up on our shores. And so I think the longer you try and suppress those conversations, the more you give it to people who will not be responsible in taking guardianship of that issue and steering it in a way that we can talk about it carefully and considered in a considered manner with the public. And I think that that may be one of the reasons that Britain is having a bit more trouble with this immigration issue, and Europe wider too.
But also in that, within language, when you think about the numbers, what are we, 700,000 people coming into the country, we said, didn't we, in a year, around that? How many of those are illegal migration? How much of that is people coming in small boats? It's a fraction of it. Most of it is legal migration.
I know.
This is why there needs to be a responsibility around language, is all I'm saying, that people need to be armed with the facts. And it is a small percentage that are coming in illegally to this country. The majority of people are being allowed in because of our immigration policy.
And I hear you, Chloe. I totally do. But one of the problems with the immigration debate is that for as long as you say to people, well, here are the facts and here are the numbers and here's the proportion and here's how many refugees we take versus Europe, who take much more. And we had all the same argument in Australia, trust me. People don't hear that.
Yep.
Totally. Exactly. Absolutely.
For as long as people see that the system is outside of their control and outside of the government that they elect control, they don't support it. And my argument is that, yes, it's not great at all to have politicians misuse this issue, but they will if we don't take responsibility for it first.
Let's think about that word invasion. So I spoke to someone in Sunderland yesterday who said that in 10 years, Sunderland has dramatically changed. There's been deals done to house illegal immigrants in or asylum seekers in hotels. There have been, the university has taken on a lot of extra students, postgraduate students. For example, their families have come in, and the nature, the character of the area has changed because the personnel have changed. Now, if you bring this up and say, do you know what, things have changed in Sunderland, people go, oh, no, you're racist. No, you can't talk about that. No, you're racist. And then Nigel Farage comes along and says, well, Sunderland's been invaded, hasn't it? If you're told you can't talk about it, and then you have someone who is a leader who connects, rightly or wrongly, and talks about it being an invasion, well, that's going to be popular with some people. It's irresponsible. It's wrong. He shouldn't say it. But there is an appeal there, and 4.1 million people voted for reform in the UK, in this country, and we can't ignore those people.